Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Fred Roberts reporting from St. Gregory College Preparatory School on April 19th, 2013. Just goofing around a little bit. I would all like to introduce to you Sam Zelman. Sam was born October 6th, 2 years after the state of Arizona was founded, which was what year?
1914.
Come on, you guys got it.
I know my birth date. Isn't that amazing?
And it has a very long and just amazing resume I'm looking at. But what just amazes me is that Sam was one of the founders of CNN, and having been given that responsibility at the time was huge. But to have the credentials and I believe the leadership in order to take on that responsibility was enormous. And then he retired from CNN 28 years ago as the vice president and executive producer of CNN. Would you prefer us to call you Mr. Zelman or Sam?
Thank you, Sam. I haven't been to a class before where I didn't have to answer questions, so if you're forced to ask a question.
Yeah, so what Sam and I will do is, I'll ask some of the questions that you all presented to him, but if something comes up that, you think of this, you think of that.
Fine.
Yeah.
I was born in Washington, D.C. in 1914, and since most of you weren't around at that time, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what life was like then. I walked to school because I don't remember any school buses at that time, 7 or 8 or 9 blocks, something like that. My father would get up at 4 a.m. and go down to the basement to stoke the furnace so there'd be heat in the winter time. Now, of course, you just go to a meter on the wall and set it, and it all happens with a flick of a finger. We had gas lights when I was born, and electricity came in several years later, but we kept the gas lights in the house with the little bulb, not a bulb, but a net cover that turned the flame into white. And then we put in electric lights when the electric lights came in, but we kept the gas because the electricity was very spotty. It came in, then it would go out for a few hours and so on. So we had a dual system of lighting. We didn't have refrigeration because that was when electricity was spotty, so we had the iceman come by. An iceman would drive down the street and sell us a block of ice that would go into an ice box, and the ice would last for 2 or 3 days, and we'd have a pan under the box which collected the water from the melted ice. A milkman came by and left milk in glass bottles at the doorstep, and a produce man came by, and these were all wagons pulled by horses, and the produce man would have his wagon filled with fruit and vegetables, and my mother would come out and buy from them. I had a paper route where I got $6 a month from the Washington Star, and it consisted of a little red wagon which the Star gave me as a gratuity, and I carried the papers through several blocks and threw them on doorsteps. But that $6 came in handy. Now let's jump to college. My family moved from Washington, D.C. to California because they wanted me to go to college after high school. And the only college that we knew of that was free was the University of California at Berkeley. So we moved to California and established our residence for a year so that we would qualify as Californians. And I went to Berkeley. The only fee on admission was 25 cents a month for towel service at the gym, and that really was the only charge. Now, of course, you have to have very successful parents to get 3 or 4 kids into college. It really is fantastic. I worked my way through college by living at Barrington Hall, which was a cooperative. You paid $20 a month, and all the labor in the place, the making of the beds and the cooking of the food and everything else, was done by the students who stayed there. So we only paid $20 a month for that, which is pretty easy to handle. Most of us worked our way through college. I worked at a supermarket as a cashier for 25 cents an hour for about 9 or 10 hours on Saturdays. And then another cashier and I, both students, would go to a Chinese restaurant and for 25 cents have a good dinner, and then go to a movie and sit in the balcony for 25 cents, so that the proportions were made to order for poor students. My first job, well, let me explain my interest in journalism. I used to read newspapers avidly at that time, and still do. Number one, I like the subject to change often, and with a newspaper, your eye can move from one story to another, and I thought that would be a great way to make a living. And also, the dramatic appeal of being a foreign correspondent would be nice. But actually, when I did get a job on a newspaper, I moved into the management section very early and didn't have too much experience as a foreign correspondent. I started in radio as a news writer, and then when television came in, we had very primitive programming. The local stations used 15 minutes of what they called news, which was 5 minutes of news, 5 minutes of weather, and 5 minutes of sports. Of course, there were commercials from the very beginning to pay for it, so it was a very skimpy coverage of the news. The news sources were wire services, the Associated Press and United Press, and they provided services to subscribers, or with the Associated Press, it was with members. It was an association of members of newspapers, and they tried to be fairly objective. Newspapers have had columnists for a long time, and also people who wrote opinion columns that appeared opposite the editorial page. And that was never my favorite, but obviously that's where the appeal is for newspapers. People cry out for opinion. They want points of view. And that's why Fox News, which is highly opinionated in one direction, has the largest audiences. And I have here, for your perusal sometime, the ratings of television programs and radio programs based on, well, you'd recognize the O'Reilly Factor is the most popular news show. Hannity comes next. Then the Fox Report is fourth, and so on. And CNN is way down, and they try to be fairly objective.
And these are popular because they're so opinionated.
Well, I think opinion divides the audience quite a bit. And it also permits an emotional approach to the news. And I think it contributes a lot to attracting an audience with outrageous tones of voice, if not in the material itself. And I can understand why they are very popular. On the other hand, you'd think there would be a liberal point of view that would also be opinionated and have a little of the rabble-rousing, but it doesn't exist, and I can't explain that.
I'd like to get into some of the questions that the students asked.
Sure.
But, what always gets me is that what did Ted Turner do? I mean, how did you guys, it sounds like you and a couple of people got together and we're going to do this.
Ted Turner's father was an owner of a billboard company. When he died, he left Ted $30 million, which is a good head start for even today, I think. And so he bought himself an FM radio station. At that time, satellites were just becoming known to the average layman, and it was possible to send signals up into the stratosphere and send it around the world or across the country. His idea was to make a national station out of the FM station that he bought, which was really down on its luck, and start a cable company. The cable systems were primitive, and most cable companies didn't have any experience in broadcasting, and so they just carried programs that they bought from networks and so on.
So like sitcoms.
And yes,
Okay.
like sitcoms, talk shows, and commercials. They were loaded with commercials. Well, anyway, from that, he learned that news was a fairly inexpensive commodity compared to entertainment. A 1-hour television show cost at least $1 million per program. Whereas news, you write it and give it to a guy who can read, and he can sit in front of a camera and read the news as it comes in from the Associated Press and United Press International. United Press no longer exists. AP does. And then they made connections with local papers and found that most people were more interested in what happened in their own communities. So news of real importance for the American citizen, which is to know how his government works and to watch it and so on. You have a feeling sometimes that many Americans feel that government is just a pain, that it's a nuisance, and that our government is too big and wastes a lot of money. Well, the only tool of a civilized society is a government, which represents the people. You take care of, in the biblical sense almost, those who need help, those who are the weak links in our society in terms of earning power, health, and so on. And he started the cable news network. After a while, he hired people who could work for very little money. And it was my job as vice president of the company to go around and hire kids out of college, because those were the ones you get the cheapest. When I was working at CBS, the annual budget was $85 million. I mean, at CBS, yes, news. The budget for news alone was $85 million, and practically the only program they had was the morning news and Walter Cronkite. So we hired these students and called them video journalists, and assigned them to do any job they wanted, and when they were tired of that job, give them another job. The television industry is full of unions at the classic sense in New York professional group. And the unions allowed people only to do one skill. If they're tape editors, they edited tape. If they were camera people, they did camera work. This was a chance for graduates to come in and do a little of each. And they really knew enough to run a station on their own. And I guess if their fathers had enough money, some of them quit and worked for a station. News is the lifeblood of citizenship. If you don't know what's going on, you can't very well function effectively as a citizen. I think it's very important to know, to be a watchdog, which the press is, of the government. And the government, in turn, is a watchdog of the public interest. That is the ideal. But, you know, human beings, what they are, you have self-serving people in both fields. And in government, people are ambitious and self-serving, and they have to be watched. It doesn't mean that they're not conscientious, they're not honest, but sometimes there are exceptions.
Well, and that gets into the first question I wanted to ask is, so do you think, I mean, since this is a leadership class, do you think that journalists are leaders? And if so, what aspects of leadership do you see in them?
Journalists are a service to the community. A citizen cannot fulfill his duties without knowing how his government is functioning, the quality of education in their community, what's going on in the prisons and the police department, in every department of government. And that watchdog function is indispensable to a democracy. I have a sheet here that shows one of the boring documents that you, as news people, if you ever become a news person, you have to thumb through by the millions. Governments turned out by the Census Bureau, by research organizations and universities and so on. This one happens to be on states ranked by total taxes and per capita amount. And that is boring as hell, except when you're writing a story about your area, it's kind of important to know where your state ranks. Here is Arizona, which ranks, let me find it here, 20th in the amount of taxes they raise. Of course, there are smaller states too. But 39th in terms of the amount of tax per capita. Taxes are very low here. So when you as a citizen are responsible for influencing your elected officials, like the school board, and you think maybe they should be spending more on schools, that's an important figure. That makes a news story. As you know, the income of newspapers and wire services has shrunk dramatically, and that may mean it's tough to get a job now, but the need is ever greater for an informed citizenry. The more complicated government is and society is, the more there is a need for information. The two best papers in the country, in my opinion, are the New York Times and the Washington Post. One reason they're big is that New York's a very large city and has a much greater income than the Tucson Star, of course. And they can afford to do investigative reporting. But, you know, when I picked up the Times some time back, the headline was, Times Company announces 500 job cuts. A media research firm is quoted as saying, I expect to see more of this over the next 10 plus years as the newspaper industry adjusts to its smaller role in news dissemination and advertising. You know, we have a profit-making motive, which is primarily the motivating force of most businesses in our society. And even though the citizenship requirement in a complicated society should have more original reporting, obviously you have less if the paper's not making money. And I don't know what the answer is. Maybe the next generation will come up with an answer for that.
We're going to get to another question.
Yeah.
So you've seen a lot of leaders throughout history. And what are the values and ethics you regard as the most important for a leader?
For a leader in journalism.
Journalism?
Yeah. Well, leader should have the public's interest at heart. He's got to serve the people. Every industry that serves the people at a fair price is successful. And even those that aren't being fair sometimes are exposed and shown to be a problem. Just as many public officials are elected and wind up in jail because they're not being, not serving the public interest primarily.
Okay. Let's see, here's another one. Okay. Excluding U.S. presidents, In your opinion, who was the most profound leader in your lifetime?
In the White House,
Excluding the White House.
excluding the White House. I like Henry Kissinger, Brzezinski, what's his first name? I can't pronounce it. People who have advised presidents and who really have been the power behind the president. And Cheney, who is really regarded as a negative in many ways because he isn't a charming man, and his point of view is some regard as self-serving. I don't, and I really have very little opinion to express because all my life as a newsman, I've tried to be objective and present information in a factual way. I'm trying to think of somebody else. I did write down some names.
How about internationally? People outside of the U.S.?
They all seem to be villains, don't they? Most countries are countries that we have to guard against. I'll get back to you on that. Any other questions?
Well, I guess, I'm thinking about big events that took place in history. I mean, how much did we know about Hitler when, he was
Well,
in power?
Hitler appealed to the selfishness of the German people, and he became a military leader. He was a fascinating speaker, mesmerizing speaker, and he just had the power to rally people around him. And the fact that he encouraged the Germans to dream of being the dominant race in the country and to be the most important country in the world, appealed to people who found that living was a struggle. Again, an educated electorate is the most important ingredient of a democracy and a well-run country. And we have a long way to go in that direction.
But would you say that the U.S. is ahead of all the countries in terms of being educated and
Well, not necessarily. They're pretty well educated in the Scandinavian countries. The Asian countries send their good students to this country to go to college, which is a real tribute to our higher education system. I know when I went to Berkeley, you go to the library on Saturdays, 80% of the faces were Asian faces because they were dedicated, their culture and their motivation was superior to Americans who are diverted by sports, and the media is lacking in basic, serious information, and part of that is that profits are down. If you pick up the local paper here, they do have national news, but very often the most important news is not on page one, it's inside. And my guess is the sports department is bigger than the news staff that covers stories. But they do stories that take some enterprise. The easiest thing to do when you have a limited staff of reporters, is listen to police radio. And if there's a car accident, you send a cameraman there and a reporter, and he comes back in a couple of hours and he has a story. But to do investigative stories, here's one that comes out of the Daily Star, and it took some investigating. Income gap widens. Report rates Arizona #1 in the growth of wealth disparity. That took some investigation, but then that is 7 years old, that story. They're struggling. And I think the citizenship, the people of this country and the cities they live in should demand more of their newspapers and news sources and radio and television. As you know, radio and television gets most of its news out of the newspapers at a local level.
Any questions? Well, then does it concern you that is the media feeding the taste of the pop culture?
Yes, they're feeding the taste of the pop culture because that's where the profits are. The larger the audience, the more they can charge for their advertising. And the lower the common denominator, the more readers you have. So if readers want to read about traffic accidents and sports and what else is popular in the paper?
Yeah, entertainment.
Personal entertainment, celebrity news. It's just amazing how much news is in the papers, especially in crime stories, crimes that are individual crimes that have necessarily no political or social significance outside the family that's involved. That we just like to read that sort of thing. That used to be called tabloid journalism. In New York City, there's a room for all of that. The New York Times has a lot of investigative reporting. The Daily News and the Post, which are tabloid papers with big black headlines and so on, have the news that appeals to most people. And I don't know how you increase the appetite for the more important stuff. It's like sitting down to a meal that's all dessert or trivia, which leaves you with nothing to build your citizenship on.
Okay, well, so I'm going to get back to the question that I asked earlier, probably phrase it a different way. So what's one vital leadership quality that's needed in journalism?
Well,
I mean, you said
I think there is leadership in journalism, but the leadership has one primary motive for which they are hired and for which they might be fired, which is the profit margin. And that's our society, and I don't know what the answer is there. The New York Times, on the other hand, is also interested in profit, and that's why they let 500 people go in one announcement. But they have enough money from the readership they have, which is in the millions, to pay for that. The smaller the city, the more limited the coverage, the less the profit from advertising.
Well, but what about investigative reporters who take risks? I mean, even for their own safety, to uncover a story. Well,
I mean, it's a dangerous pursuit if you're given an opportunity to investigate that. I mean, let's say you're assigned to follow the the mysterious lead they have on the two killers in the Boston Marathon. That could be very dangerous. You could get bumped off. I don't know what the motive is of anybody doing a crime like that. But it takes time too. The New York Times can say to a reporter, take as long as you have to, 2, 3, 4 weeks or whatever, but find out what the problem is with unemployment in New York City, let us say, and find out what kind of people they are they looking for work and so on. And that's fine, but the local paper can't afford that. They expect a reporter to come back as soon as possible and to look it up. Look it up on the computer. And that's not easy to do. A computer is a product of other people's work, and it usually is not original reporting.
Yeah, let me get to another question here. Okay, so you've worked at a lot of different places around the world. What
City do I like best?
What story have you most enjoyed covering?
Well, you don't enjoy most stories because they're tragedies.
Or the most significant, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I got in Czechoslovakia years ago when, I forget what year it was, when the Russians had invaded Czechoslovakia in the post-war years, not World War II. By the way, World War II, in case you've forgotten, is, World War I never had the name of World War I because nobody knew there would be another one. But World War II left a lot of residue of problems. A young Czech soldier killed himself in the town square in Prague, and I was sent in to cover that with the camera crew and so on. And the only reason they sent me was that I hadn't been on the road for a long time, so I had a clean passport. But Czechoslovakia was not admitting correspondence at that time. I had a clean passport. I looked like a tourist, I guess, at that time, and went in. And then we had the problem of getting the film out after we covered the story. And news material wasn't allowed through the borders. So I rented 2 cars from Hertz. Hertz is there in Prague, believe it or not. And hired one Czech boy of about 10 to sit in the back seat and pretend he's sick. And he lay over the reels of film. And the idea was that he'd get through the border because the driver would say, here are my papers, but my buddy is sick in the back, and they'd leave him alone. And they did, and it got through. The other car took the other half of the film material and didn't get through. But they were just expelled. But Czechoslovakia was a beautiful country. The music was good, the food was good in the restaurants. And it was an experience.
Just trying to sneak over the border with the film? Or just to get it out?
No, we got half of it out.
Yeah.
With the kids. One kid was one car was sent to Nuremberg, where we could get the plane out. And the other car was sent to Vienna, also, which was open for air traffic. And you had to engage in tricks like that. And that's still true in many parts of the world, that press coverage is not covered. You don't see any American correspondents in Syria now.
Well, okay, with that in mind, what do you think has changed the most about journalism since you started in the industry?
Well, mostly it's changed in the transmission expansion, the technology, the fact that words are instantly flown around the world through the airwaves. It's almost impossible now the positive side is it's almost impossible now to keep a nation uninformed because they have cell phones, they have computers, they can communicate around the world, and it's hard for the government to prevent that. And if they did, the public would be incensed. So that the transmission of news so effectively is not a plus always, though. The fact is that when 3 networks, for instance, in the United States, dominated the airwaves, ABC, CBS, and NBC, they had huge audiences, and obviously their advertising was very expensive, so that their income was great and they could hire large staffs. CBS had thousands of correspondents all over the world. Now they have very few because the audience has been splintered so that they have a small share of the audience. I have here this is a rating sheet for all the television stations that are heard in Tucson. I mean, not only television, but radio and so on. There must be 50 of them on this one sheet. I don't know how you conquer that problem either. But there will always be young people who will be motivated and dedicated to serve the public interest and to try to try to go and cover news, information that all of us need to be effective citizens. You know, we should be watching, checking on the hospitals here, checking on the schools, checking on every institution that serves the public interest. And that isn't possible even in Washington anymore. There are fewer reporters covering Washington. So the government is free to engage in what reporters call hanky-panky, neglecting their jobs or misappropriating funds and so on.
So the most effective way to have a good government is to also have a good
press,
good journalism.
That's right. You know, if what's his name, the foundation with all the money?
Gates.
If Bill Gates would spend some of his money on journalism, it would be appreciated. But, you know, one of the problems of a free society is the motivation has to come from inside of us. And we don't have that discipline. I know that people are influenced from the day they're born. You were at the dinner table with your parents always when they eat at 6 o'clock at night, or do they send you to the television set to keep them alone so they can have a quiet dinner, father and mother and so on? And that's family upbringing and family curiosity. I know when I was a kid, my father would always say, "What did you learn in school today?" And I would say nothing, of course, because I wasn't that organized. But that kind of motivation is very important. And you bring that advantage, if it starts with a family, to your school. So that if we all gain a sense of responsibility for our government, for our schools, for everything, that's fine. Obviously, in Arizona, schools, public schools, suffer from that low tax rate. That makes me sound like a liberal. We should have more taxes. But we do need support to have the kind of democracy that we want, or the kind of republic that we want. I really don't choose between Republican and Democratic. We all have the same responsibilities.
Well, and with that, and another question from the students. So of all the presidents you've seen in your lifetime, which one was the most effective leader, and why?
Well, I would choose one you wouldn't expect. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a man of the people in the sense that he had once been a union organizer for the Actors Guild. He ran a state well. He had the common touch. He was liked. He was personable. That's not true of many presidents we've had. They haven't been close to the people. Let's see, who else? Truman, I admired a lot during my day because he came in at the death of FDR? No. Yeah. Mm-hmm. At the death of FDR. And he was a man with a humble beginning. He had a haberdashery store in Kansas City, and he had the common touch. And people could relate to him. He also was responsible for dropping the nuclear weapon, the first one, in Japan on 2 cities, Nagasaki and the other one, Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. And that saved a lot of lives because it ended the war very quickly. And he calculated that. And also people could relate to him. He was a man of the people. The president we have today is a good president, but I'm not sure he has the common touch. The fact is he spent most of his life in academic circles, and he is brilliant, no question about that. But he doesn't seem to be able to rally public opinion. Which has resulted in a lot of partisanship in our society. You're either a Republican and will do and see nothing good with the president, or you're a Democrat and see everything good with them. And the two won't vote together on the same issue. They won't compromise in Congress. And that's really a place to stalemate, a blanket of no action over the Congress. Personality seems to be very important in every field you go into. Heads of corporations usually have a lot of personality, even if you never get to shake their hand.
Do you have any questions? Any just even random?
Let me see if
Well, how about
Wait, I have a question.
okay.
What would be your advice to, because I'm in journalism at school, so what would be your advice to young journalists?
for being a journalist,
Just like to the young high school students who,
well, come from wealthy parents for one thing. And then if you can work for very little money and prove yourself, you'll be fine. Or you can become a columnist and have a lot of emotional appeal and create a habit-forming readership. Years ago, during the First Depression, I remember many would-be young people would write a column on the current news, send it to 100 papers in the country, tell them they could use it for nothing. And then if they ran it, you were lucky. And if they did run it, and they found that there was a following and they get mail from it, they would say, why don't you write us a regular column? And they created their own jobs that way. But I think journalism has got to have a tremendous future, because as our society grows more complicated, it's more and more necessary to understand what motivates people, what motivates government, and if the government is to be a watchdog of the public interest, which it is by having laws on health and safety and traffic lights and so on, then the press has to watch the watchdogs. And it's a very stimulating and exciting and public service calling to be into journalism. I think if you go to a good school, I don't mean good school, take that back. If you go to a school that attracts wealthy students like Harvard, the Ivy League schools, Berkeley is a pretty good school too, you will find that the friends you make are sons and daughters of corporation people who can help you find your first job, which is very important. If you want to be a movie writer, it's the same analogy. You go to a college in Los Angeles or Beverly Hills, well, there is no college in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles or UCLA or USC, and you find that you're meeting the friends, sons, and daughters of important people in the industry. Contact is very important. Or if you play good football, obviously you can get a job. They'll promise you jobs even if your grades are lousy.
So, connections.
Connections are very
Sociability.
important. You just have to get somebody's attention.
To get the right people.
Sure, people get jobs by sending in a fantastic script, and the script writer happens to be in a good mood when he or she reads it and passes it on to the upper upper levels of movie making and so on. But writing is very rewarding. I enjoyed news writing, and even when I came here after 20 years of retirement, I wrote several articles for the Star and tried to make them witty and sharp enough in their writing that they would take it, and they did. And I sold them stuff even before I moved here, which was 15 years ago. I retired in New York City, which happens to be my favorite city, even though I was born in Washington. But if I had to choose one city to spend my life in, the most exciting would be New York. It has theater, it has the best of everything in terms of the publishing industry, even the music industry. Almost any field you can pick has a headquarters in New York. And if you get a job even at the lowest level in a company that's growing and in a field that you like, the most important thing in the world is to find something that you like to do. And when I went into news, it was for a negative reason. I didn't like to stick with the same thing all the time. You know, if you're an expert at one thing, like you're a doctor of dermatology, you're confined to that specialty all your life, and you might get tired of it. Only in journalism, as far as I know, can the subject change 10 times a day, and you can change it yourself.
Well, so with that in mind, whether it be jobs or, I don't know, future outlook, what advice would you give this group of students, high school, looking ahead to college?
Well, the sooner you find something you're interested in and can specialize in it is fine. If you want to be a writer, it's not too late to start now. It could be too late if you wait too long, because writing takes doing, and lots of it. And if you get good teachers at the college level, you get turned on by being published. When I was at Berkeley, I wrote stuff for the literary paper. I worked for the Daily Californian up there, and I had an opportunity to see stuff in print, and that's a turn on, just like it is for actors to see themselves in the movies. And the advantage of writing is that you can be anonymous. As far as walking down the street is concerned, nobody's going to ask for your autograph unless you're really, really famous.
Any other questions? What would you say is your most memorable experience? There must be a bajillion of them. If there was like an event that stands out in your lifetime.
Well, I covered nuclear testing in Nevada for CBS. When I say I covered, I was in charge of the crew and the reporters and so on. And I felt that, that was page one wherever you went, and it was pretty important. Even though I'm not that crazy about covering crime, which is also violent. I think the people need more and more reading to do. I'm trying to think of the problems that we face. The government has ongoing problems. Government jobs are very good jobs in the sense, not that they're secure, which they usually are if you're any good, but in that they're in the public interest. I mean, if you work for the health department or almost any department in government, there's a need for it. And the profit motive isn't there, which allows you to be free to pursue knowledge for knowledge's sake and for the public interest.
Any last questions? Any parting thoughts? We got to wrap up. We got next class coming up.
Okay, wait a minute. I wrote myself some notes and ignored them. Well, I recommend government service. That way you won't be motivated by profit alone. and you also won't get rich.
It's not a stable job.
Yeah. It's a job and you're doing good.
All right. Well, Sam, thank you very much.
Pleasure.